Hey everyone, this is Chapter 2 of C.L.R. James, A Political Biography by Kent Worcester. Let me get to the text. Come on. You can do it, you sack of shit. Okay. And Chapter 2 is called Modern Politics. The opportunity to move to Britain arrived in the form of an invitation from Leary and Norma Constantine to stay with them and their 4-year-old child in their new home on Meredith Street in Nelson, Lancashire. After spending a few adventuresome weeks in London during the spring of 1932, Nelson became James's primary place of residence during the first segment of his extended visit to England. Footnote: in a series published in the Port of Spain Gazette, James offered his, quote, first impressions of life in London. In one of these, he set out to capture, quote, the atmosphere of Bloomsbury, end quote, concluding that, quote, anyone who lives in this place for any length of time and remains dull need not worry himself. Nothing he will ever do will help him. He was born that way, end quote. C.L.R. James, Bloomsbury, An Encounter with Edith Sitwell, published in Anna Grimshaw's The C.L.R. James Reader. The description for the C.L.R. James Reader says, author of such classic works as Minty Alley, The Black Jacobins, and Beyond a Boundary, C.L.R. James was one of the most significant writers of our times, in a life which reflected many of the distinctive features of the 20th century. From his birth in Trinidad in 1901 to his death in Brixton, London, James made an outstanding contribution to debates on politics, history, art, literature, and sport. James's revolutionary vision has inspired social movements in the United States, Britain, Africa, and the Caribbean. It remains central to any understanding of the modern world. Until now, much of James's work has remained inaccessible, but Anna Grimshaw brings together here both published and unpublished material to give us the essential C.L.R. James. Prepared in collaboration with James in his final years, this collection offers unique insight into the range and development of his life's work. Back to the text. Although James was by nature polite and well-behaved, James must have been something of a burden as a house guest. The Constantines lived in a small 4-room house with no garden, and James, quote, kept late hours, read intensely, and was deeply interested in politics, end quote. Footnote: see Gerald Howat, Leary Constantine, published in 1975, page 76. I'm not seeing any description for this book. End footnote. Because of his personable nature and masterful athletic abilities, Leary Constantine was already a local celebrity. Playing the part of an older brother, even though he was the younger of the two by several months, Constantine subsidized James's writings and encouraged James to develop his incipient critique of colonialism. In Nelson, James and Leary collaborated on James and Constantine's in Nelson, James and Constantine collaborated on Constantine's Cricket and I, a personal history of West Indian cricket. And we looked that book up in the last chapter. Part of the foreword reads, I would like here to give my best thanks to my West Indian friend, Mr. C.L.R. James, who has given me valuable assistance in the writing of this book. Leary Constantine, Cricket and I, published 1933. End footnote. While the text focuses mostly on sports, one quintessentially Jamesian passage makes reference to their place of origin. Quote, there are few more cosmopolitan little places in the world, and one has the opportunity of hearing all sorts of languages and seeing at first hand the style and manners of some of the most important races in the world. Trinidad is a crown colony, that is to say, Trinidad is governed by the colonial office officials in England, and a movement for throwing off this yoke is gathering strength, end quote. Constantine, Cricket and I. James later described this work as, quote, the first book ever published in England by a world-famous West Indian writing as a West Indian about people and events in the West Indies, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. As James wrote in Beyond a Boundary, quote, henceforth the West Indies was speaking for itself in the modern world, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary, page 124. Although Leary Constantine shared many of James's pre-Marxist views, Constantine generally refrained from commenting on political matters in public. The scion of a local family which had a long history of accomplishments on and off the cricket pitch, Constantine was a firm believer in progressive reform and mutual respect between different social and ethnic groups. Temperamentally, he was courtly and generally moderate. As far as politics was concerned, he was anti-colonial but not explicitly anti-imperialist. Together, Constantine and James spoke to a variety of audiences in northern England about cricket, the conditions in the West Indies, and the prospects for independence. Quote, by the winter of 1933, we were in full cry all over the place, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. In the same year, James was asked to speak on a BBC program commemorating the centenary of the abolition of slavery in the British colonies. James pressed home the idea that because of their training and outlook, West Indians were ready for self-determination. Some listeners were clearly appalled. Quote, colonial officers in England and others began their protests to the BBC almost before I had finished speaking, end quote. James later wrote in Beyond a Boundary. Leary and Norma Constantine were not the only influences operating on the youthful critic of colonialism. Nelson itself was in many ways an ideal locale for James' intellectual development, an industrial town of some 40,000 inhabitants that was notorious for the militancy of the weavers who worked in its mills. Nelson had been dubbed, quote, Little Moscow in the 1920s. Footnote. On Nelson, see Anna Grimshaw, Notes on the Life and Work of C.L.R. James, in Paul Boule's edited volume, C.L.R. James and His Life and C.L.R. James, His Life and Work, published in London with Allison and Busby, 1986. Anna Grimshaw reports that the town's weavers were on strike during the summer and early fall of 1932. The description that I'm seeing for C.L.R. James, His Life and Work, edited by Paul Boule, says, C.L.R. James is one of the 20th century's most remarkable individuals. As the author of the influential book, The Black Jacobins, James is widely recognized as the premier scholar of slave revolt. The publication of his acute and sensitive volume, Beyond a Boundary, established an equal reputation as a historian of sport, and his tireless political and intellectual interventions have become the hallmark of a highly creative Marxist thinker. A brilliant dialectician and the last surviving pioneer of Pan-African liberation, James's work has never previously been studied in its entirety. Now Paul Boule, a longtime editorial collaborator with James, has produced a rich and informed analysis of his accomplishments, drawing upon extensive interviews with James's critics and erstwhile supporters, together with many previously unpublished documents. Boule's book offers an appreciative and enlightening portrait of the man and his times. The author also sheds new light on subjects ranging across Pan-Africanism, West Indian literature, British and American Marxism, and the rise of Third World nationalism. Back to the text and footnote. Leary Constantine introduces guests to some of the town's trade unionists. Many of the men Constantine knew were members of the Independent Labor Party, a radical organization that had disaffiliated from the larger Labor Party in 1932. Footnote. Nelson was one of the Independent Labor Party's strongholds. In 1912, the party had over 800 members in Nelson, making it the second largest branch in the country. See Joseph White's book, Tom Mann, published with Manchester University Press in 1991. Not seeing any descriptions of this book. But Tom Mann lived from 1856 to 1941 and was an English trade unionist and is widely recognized as a leading pioneering figure for the early labor movement in Britain. Largely self-educated, Thomas Mann became a successful organizer and a popular public speaker in the British labor movement. Back to the text and footnote. These activists vigorously attacked the paternalistic assumptions embedded in the case for West Indian self-government, and James later reported that these, quote, humorously cynical working men were a revelation and brought me down to earth, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. Perhaps the most influential of these sharp northerners was Harry Spencer, a local activist and autodidact with whom James spent a great deal of time. Not seeing anything for this Harry Spencer person. The startling impact... Wait, hold on. Footnote. The dedication page of the Black Jacobins reads, "To my good friends Harry and Elizabeth Spencer of Nelson, Lancashire, England." End footnote. The startling impact of personal conversations with working-class leftists was complemented by the ambitious non-fiction reading program that James undertook in Nelson, starting with Leon Trotsky's A History of the Russian Revolution, Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. James found it, quote, necessary to read the relevant volumes of Stalin, and, of course, I had to read Lenin in order to trace the quarrel, and thereby I reached Volume 1 of Das Kapital and the 18th Brumaire of Marx himself. End quote. Footnote. David Widgery, A Meeting with Comrade James, in Paul Boule's edited volume, C.L.R. James, His Life and Work. End footnote. It seems almost inevitable that James would sooner or later have encountered socialist ideas and attempted to make sense of the Marxist tradition. Given the wider context of economic and political crisis, as well as James's specific interest in the development of the West Indian urban working class, as evidenced by his early fiction and his exposure to trade union militancy in Port of Spain and Nelson, it is little wonder that James's initial response to Marxism was so favorable. James quickly embraced Marxism's emphasis on class and social conflict as the motor of history. Marxism may also have helped to make sense of the root causes of the international depression, the emergence of fascist movements, the spread of European colonies in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and so on. The Marxist tradition could also take credit for the October Revolution, an event which proved to be a tremendous inspiration to many first and third world intellectuals for several decades. Historical materialism offered a holistic approach to the problems of the world economy and to interrelations between class, race, economics, and politics. For a variety of reasons, then, both biographical and intellectual, the young Caribbean writer had succumbed to a committed Marxist position by the conclusion of his stay in Nelson, Lancashire. The reading program encompassed more than Marxist, Stalinist, and Spenglerian text, however. In addition to unraveling the controversies of classical Marxism, James read extensively in the French and British literature on Toussaint L'Ouverture and the San Domingo slave revolution of the 1800s, the late 1800s. And Wikipedia says, for Toussaint L'Ouverture was a Haitian general and the most prominent leader of the Haitian Revolution. During his life, Louverture first fought and allied with Spanish forces against Saint Domingue royalists, and then joined with Republican France, became Governor General for life of Saint Domingue, and lastly fought against Bonaparte's Republican troops. As a revolutionary leader, Louverture displayed military and political acumen that helped transform the fledgling slave rebellion into a revolutionary movement. Along with Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Louverture is known as one of the, quote, fathers of Haiti. Toussaint Louverture was born as a slave in the French colony of San Domingue, now known as Haiti. Toussaint L'Ouverture was a devout Catholic and was manumitted as an affranchi, ex-slave, before the French Revolution, identifying as a Creole for the greater part of his life. During Toussaint L'Ouverture's time as an affranchi, he became a salaried employee and overseer of his former master's plantation, and later became a wealthy slave owner himself. Toussaint L'Ouverture owned several coffee plantations at Petit Cormier, Grand Vière, and Henry. At the start of the Haitian Revolution, he was nearly 50 years old and began his military career as a lieutenant to Georges Biassou, an early leader of the 1791 War for Freedom in San Domingo. Initially allied with the Spaniards of neighboring Santo Domingo, Louverture switched his allegiances to the French when the new Republican government abolished slavery. Louverture gradually established control over the whole island and used his political and military influence to gain dominance over his rivals. Throughout Louverture's years in power, Louverture worked to balance the economy and security of San Domingo, worried about the economy which had stalled. Toussaint L'Ouverture restored the plantation system using paid labor, negotiated trade agreements with the United Kingdom and the United States, and maintained a large and well-trained army. Louverture seized power in San Domingo, established his own system of government, and promulgated his own colonial constitution in 1801 that named Toussaint L'Ouverture as Governor-General for life, which challenged Napoleon Bonaparte's authority. In 1802, Toussaint L'Ouverture was invited to a parley by the French Divisional General Jean-Baptiste Brunet, but was arrested upon his arrival. Toussaint L'Ouverture was deported to France and jailed at the Fort de Joux. Toussaint L'Ouverture died in 1803. Although Louverture died before the final and most violent stage of the Haitian Revolution, his achievements set the grounds for the Haitian army's final victory. Suffering massive losses in multiple battles at the hands of the British and Haitian armies, and losing thousands of men to yellow fever, the French capitulated and withdrew permanently from San Domingo the very same year. The Haitian Revolution continued under Louverture's lieutenant, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who declared independence on the 1st of January 1804, thereby establishing the sovereign state of Haiti. And the Wikipedia for the Haitian Revolution says, the Haitian Revolution was a successful insurrection by self-liberated slaves against French colonial rule in San Domingo, now the sovereign state of Haiti. The revolution was the only known slave uprising in human history that led to the founding of a state which was both free from slavery, though not from forced labor, and ruled by non-whites and former captives. The revolt began on the 22nd of August, 1791, and ended in 1804, the former colony's independence. It involved black, biracial, French, Spanish, British, and Polish participants, with the ex-slave Toussaint L'Ouverture emerging as Haiti's most prominent general. The successful revolution was a defining moment in the history of the Atlantic world, and the revolution's effects on the institution of slavery were felt throughout the Americas. The end of French rule and the abolition of slavery in the former colony was followed by a successful defense of the freedoms the former slaves had won, with the collaboration of already free people of color, of their independence from white Europeans. The revolution was the largest slave uprising since Spartacus's unsuccessful revolt against the Roman Republic nearly 1,900 years earlier. Bracket. Failed verification, bracket, and challenged long-held European beliefs about alleged black inferiority and about slaves' ability to achieve and maintain their own freedom. The rebels' organizational capacity and tenacity under pressure inspired stories that shocked and frightened slave owners in the hemisphere. Compared to other Atlantic revolutions, the events in Haiti have received comparatively little public attention in retrospect. Historian Michel Rolfe Trujillo characterizes the historiography of the Haitian Revolution as being, quote, silenced by that of the French Revolution. Back to the text. This preoccupation with Haiti's colonial past aroused not only out of a general interest in world history and in the concrete dynamics of revolutionary change, but also out of a concern for integrating black diasporic history and revolutionary politics. As leader of the Haitian Rebellion, Toussaint L'Ouverture conveyed a literate, capable, and, as we shall see, tragic quality that would have appealed to a radicalized graduate of Queen's Royal College. Toussaint L'Ouverture, it may be suggested, successfully negotiated the difficult transition that Mr. Haynes backed away from. To leave a comfortable sinecure, Toussaint worked as an animal steward on a large farm and actively participated in the struggles of the barefoot masses. By 1934, James had decided to write a book on Toussaint and San Domingo. This project dovetailed nicely with his deepening attachment both to Marxism and to the cause of full independence for colonial nations. Moving to London at the very beginning of 1934, James bade farewell to his friends in northern England and prepared to find a suitable role in the British capital in the context of Depression-era politics. I guess now would be a good time to look up Black Jacobins. The Black Jacobins, Toussaint L'Ouverture and the San Domingo Revolution is a 1938 book by Trinidadian historian C.L.R. James and is a history of the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804. James went to Paris to research this work, where he met Haitian military historian Alfred Auguste Nemours. James's text places the revolution in the context of the French Revolution and focuses on the leadership of Toussaint L'Ouverture, who was born a slave but rose to prominence espousing the French revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality. These ideals, which many French revolutionaries did not maintain consistently with regard to the black humanity of their colonial possessions, were embraced, according to James, with a greater purity by the persecuted blacks of Haiti. Such ideals, quote, meant far more to them than to any Frenchman, end quote. James examines the brutal conditions of slavery as well as the social and political status of the slave owners, poor, quote, small whites, and, quote, free blacks, and mulattoes leading up to the Revolution. The book explores the dynamics of the Caribbean economy and the European feudal system during the era before the Haitian Revolution and places each revolution in comparative historical and economic perspective. Toussaint L'Ouverture becomes a central and symbolic character in James's narrative of the Haitian Revolution. His complete embodiment of the revolutionary ideals of the period was, according to James, incomprehensible even to the revolutionary French, who had not seemed to grasp the urgencies of these ideals in the minds and spirits of a people rising from slavery. L'Ouverture had defiantly asserted that he intended, quote, to cease to live before gratitude dies in my heart, before I cease to be faithful to France and to my duty, before the God of liberty is profaned and sullied by the liberticides, before they can snatch from my hands that sword, those arms, which France confided to me for the defense of its rights and those of humanity, for the triumph of liberty and equality, end quote. The French bourgeoisie could not understand this motivation, according to James, and mistook it for rhetoric or bombast. Quote, rivers of blood were to flow before they understood. Rivers of blood were to flow before they understood, end quote, James writes. James wrote in the Black Jacobins that the, quote, cruelties of property and privilege are always more ferocious than the revenges of poverty and oppression, for the one aims at perpetuating resented injustice, the other is merely a momentary passion soon appeased, end quote. The book was first published in London in 1938 by Zecker and Warburg, who had recently... I'm not going to actually read this whole thing. I can't. I have to I'm reading this for school, and I have to get through it. So I can't read the whole description right there. I'm reading this mostly to kind of get a feel for C.L.R. James's life, and kind of try to, especially like understanding how his relationship to the Soviet Union evolves through his life. As a resident Briton, Nello seems to have been blessed with good fortune. Is Nello is what I think his parents called him, or people in his life called C.L.R. James. One of the people that Constantine introduced James to was Neville Cardus, the Manchester Guardian's chief cricket correspondent. Wikipedia says Neville Cardus lived from 1888 to 1975 and was an English writer and critic from an impoverished home background and mainly self-educated. He became the Manchester Guardian's cricket correspondent in 1919 and its chief music critic in 1927, holding the two posts simultaneously until 1940. Neville Cardus's contributions to these two distinct fields in the years before the Second World War established Neville Cardus's reputation as one of the foremost critics of his generation. Cardus's approach to cricket writing was innovative, turning what had previously been largely a factual form into vivid description and criticism. He is considered by contemporaries to have influenced every subsequent critic writer. Although Neville Cardus achieved his largest readership for his cricket reports and books, Neville Cardus considered music criticism as his principal vocation. Without any formal music training, Neville Cardus was initially influenced by the older generation of critics, in particular Samuel Langford and Ernest Newman, but developed his own individual style of criticism, subjective, romantic, and personal, in contrast to the objective analysis characterized by Newman. Cardus's opinions and judgments were often forthright and unsparing, which sometimes caused friction with leading performers. Nevertheless, Neville Cardus's personal charm and gregarious nature enabled him to form lasting friendships in the cricketing and musical worlds with, among others, Newman, Sir Thomas Beecham, and Sir Donald Bradman. Neville Cardus spent the Second World War years in Australia, where he wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald and gave regular radio talks. He also wrote books on music and completed his autobiography. After Neville Cardus's return to England, he resumed his connection with the Manchester Guardian as its London music critic. Neville Cardus continued to write on cricket and produce books on both his specialisms. Cardus's work was publicly recognized by his appointment as a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE, in 1964, and the award of a knighthood in 1967, while the music and cricket worlds acknowledged Neville Cardus with numerous honors. In his last years, he became a guru and inspirational figure to aspiring young writers. Back to the text. Soon James was covering county and test matches for The Guardian, the Glasgow Herald, and a number of other publications. Employment as a cricket correspondent enabled James to engage in political and intellectual pursuits. The fact that professional cricket had a lengthy but finite season meant that James could afford to spend 1 or 2 winters in Paris researching the history of San Domingo at the National Archives. In London, he joined the Independent Labour Party and fraternized with a wide circle of literary and leftist types, which included novelists, anarchists, West Indian and African students, publishers, and other intellectuals, such as the brilliant German Marxist theorist Karl Korsch. Footnote. Author's interview with George Rawlik, December 28, 1981. And footnote. London was an international crossroads for Pan-African thought and activism in the interwar period. International events, particularly those involving colonial issues, helped to propel the city's exiled blacks into political activity. By the end of World War I, colonialism encompassed 20% of the globe's landmass and over 10% of the world's population. The conquest of African and other Third World territories in the 19th and early 20th centuries by the major European powers constituted the most intensive period of imperial expansion in world history. Movements for political and socio-economic self-determination, many of them led by intellectuals who had resided in Europe's capitals at one time or another, emerged as a militant response to the age of imperialism. A key event in the development of anti-colonial agitation in this period was Fascist Italy's 1935 blitzkrieg invasion of Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia, a bid for national glory and imperial conquest. Those who, quote, thought that the era of gunboat diplomacy was at an end, that imperialism was just a schoolboy phase from the past, suddenly now saw for themselves how it operated with a nation hacking its way towards empire at the cost of everything sacred, end quote. Ras McConan, Pan-Africanism from Within, as recorded and edited by Kenneth King. Fuck. I'm going to look this book up. Pan-Africanism from Within by Ras McConan, published with Oxford University Press, 1973. Or was published with Oxford University Press in 1973, and the description on Google Books says, a Guyanese by birth and a Kenyan by citizenship, Ras McConan would still regard these two aspects of his life as accidents of history. His roots and destiny are in the continent of Africa. For the last half of the 20th century, Ras McConan has striven, along with other major architects of Pan-Africanism, to reconcile the forces that still divide the continent. This volume is a further contribution to that struggle. McConan's analysis of the Pan-African movement starts in the former British Guyana in the early 20s, warms up to the North American scene where, as a young man, he got increasingly more aware of the African and diasporic African person's position in world history. He then describes his days in London and Manchester from the mid-30s to the 50s, Accra, Ghana, until the fall of Kwame Nkrumah in 1966, and thereafter Nairobi, Kenya, where what's the hell is this guy's name? Ras McConan worked and made his transition. Although the narrative is peppered with the most delightful character sketches of early African and other black leaders, the author's main concern is to interpret the quality of life amongst black people at home and abroad. He does so by employing a wide historical perspective and by infusing into his study of particular Pan-African actors his knowledge of the intellectual and political climate at large. He produces in the process a vivid participator's commentary on whole areas that have been quite neglected in conventional studies of Pan-Africanism, black intergroup relations in North America and the African diaspora in the Caribbean, race relations in Britain, black intellectuals and the white left, black expatriates and African socialism. These are just a few of the themes examined against a background of individual famous personalities as well as others not documented before. With an autobiographical thread that runs throughout, McConan's narrative is a uniquely diversified Pan-African portrait. Back to the text and footnote. The symbolism of an assault on independent Abyssinia shocked and galvanized racially conscious blacks across the globe. Benito Mussolini's military aggression was viewed with alarm not only by rival European powers, but by the de facto enemies of the European order. Footnote. For example, a Friends of Ethiopia committee was formed in 1935 in Port of Spain, quote, with links to similar organizations elsewhere in the Caribbean, end quote. 2 years later, a Club L'Ouverture was set up to, quote, promote the interests of blacks in Trinidad and to disseminate knowledge about and pride in Africa, end quote. See Bridget Brereton, A History of Modern Trinidad, 1783 to 1962, published in 1981. Back to the text, end footnote. In London, a number of individuals came together to mobilize against fascist aggression in Africa. Among them were Amy Ashwood Garvey, Jomo Kenyatta, T. Ras McConan, ITA Wallace Johnson, and one or two others, including C.L.R. James. The organization they founded was the International African Friends of Abyssinia. Wikipedia says the International African Friends of Abyssinia, also known as the International African Friends of Ethiopia, was an organization established in 1935 in London, England, to protest against Italian aggression against Abyssinia. See Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Its membership was composed of many important Pan-African figures, several of whom later formed the International African Service Bureau. End footnote. The organization they founded was the International African Friends of Abyssinia, whose aim was to rally the British around the Abyssinian cause. Garvey and company were joined in their efforts by Sylvia Pankhurst, the great suffragette, as well as George Padmore, the son of Alphonso Nurse. By this time, Padmore had already broken with the international communist movement in protest against the, quote, pragmatic drift of communist strategy during the Popular Front period. During the 1920s, communists had loudly insisted that colonialism was an enemy of socialism. By the mid-1930s, at the direction of Stalin and in the aftermath of Hitler's rise to power, the International Confederation of Communist Parties, the Comintern, decreed that Western liberal democracy was on the whole preferable to authoritarian nationalism. As a result of this new policy of cooperation, communist parties suddenly clamped down on all unauthorized forms of anti-colonial zeal within their sphere of influence. As James remembered, Padmore arrived early one morning at his front door to express his dismay over the new line. Quote, Padmore strongly opposed any attempt to downplay the struggle against British, French, and Dutch colonialism, as he complained, quote, but how can I do that, end quote, he said, quote, Germany and Japan have no colonies in Africa. How can I attack them? Britain and France are the ones with colonies in Africa, and America is the most prejudiced country in the world, end quote, end quote. As a result of communism's tacit alliance with the West, Padmore broke with the movement and lent his considerable talents to groups like the International African Friends of Abyssinia. The group also benefited from the contribution that George Padmore's companion Dorothy Padmore made to its intellectual and organizational development. Dorothy Pizer, or Dorothy Padmore, lived from 1906 to 1964 and was a British working-class anti-racist activist, secretary, and publishing worker. In the 1940s and 1950s, she was the partner, supporter, and collaborator of Pan-African activist and communist George Padmore. Back to the text. As a leading member of the organization, James publicly offered to enlist in the Abyssinian army. James later explained his motives in the pages of the Independent Labour Party's new leader. Quote, my hope was to get into the army. It would have given me an opportunity to make contact not only with the masses of the Abyssinians and other Africans, but in the ranks with them I would have had the best possible opportunity of putting across the international socialist case, ... I did not intend to spend the rest of my life in Abyssinia, but all things considered, I thought and still think that 2 or 3 years there, given the fact that I am a Negro and am especially interested in the African Revolution, was well worth the attempt, end quote. James, fighting for the Abyssinian Empire, new leader, June 5th, 1936. End footnote. By the time this offer had been made, however, Abyssinia's antiquated military forces had been routed on the battlefront. Amy Ashwood Garvey joined James Padmore, Kenyatta, McConan, Wallace Johnson, W.E.F. Ward, and Fitz Braithwaite to form a successor organization, the International African Service Bureau, or IASB, with the aim of furthering the cause of anti-colonialism. Active membership in the Bureau was restricted to people of African descent, quote, non-Africans, end quote, who wanted to, quote, demonstrate in a practical way their interest in Africa and the cause of the colonial peoples, end quote, were invited to become associate members. Footnote. See the article, What is the International African Service Bureau? Advertisement. See what is the International African Service Bureau advertisement appearing on inside back page of Eric Williams' Negro in the Caribbean. Christ, I read that terribly. I'm not seeing any good descriptions for this book. And footnote. Again, I think I read this Wikipedia in the last chapter. I'm going to read again. The International African Service Bureau, IASB, was a Pan-African organization founded in London in 1937 by West Indians George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Amy Ashwood Garvey, T. Ras McConan, and Kenyan nationalist Jomo Kenyatta and Sierra Leonean labor activist and agitator ITA Wallace Johnson. Chris Braithwaite, also known as Jones, was secretary of this organization. The Bureau emerged from the International African Friends of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and intended to address issues relating to Africa and the African diaspora to the British general public, similar in design and organization to the West African Youth League. The International African Service Bureau also sought to inform the public about the grievances faced by those in colonial Africa and create a list of desired reforms and freedoms that would help the colonies. The Bureau also hoped to encourage new African trade unions to affiliate themselves with the British labor movement. To further its interest, it had weekly meetings at Hyde Park where members discussed labor strikes in the Caribbean and Ethiopia. It also supplied speakers to branches of the Labour Party, trade unions, and the League of Nations Union, and provided questions to be asked in front of Parliament regarding legislation, working conditions, and trade union regulations. The IASB journal, International African Opinion, was edited by C.L.R. James. In 1939, the International African Service Bureau worked alongside the League of Colored Peoples and the West African Students' Union to campaign against the color bar introduced by Adjutant General Robert Gordon Finlayson in the British Army. The organization lasted until about 1945. Back to the text. In an advertisement that appeared in the leftist monograph series Fact, the International African Service Bureau billed itself as, quote, primarily an African organization run solely by Africans, end quote. The ad went on to say that the Bureau, quote, serves as a clearinghouse of information on matters affecting Africans and people of African descent. It supplies speakers to organizations, convenes meetings and discussions. It publishes pamphlets, books, memoranda, etc. It is anti-imperialist in character and outlook, end quote. Footnote. Fact, London, number 18, 1938, page 95. In a later advertisement, the Bureau announced that it sought, quote, to help enlighten British public opinion about conditions in the colonies, protectorates, and mandated territories in Africa, the West Indies, and other parts of the empire. In this way, the Bureau hopes that the people of the United Kingdom, who are supposed to be the, quote, trustees of the colonial peoples, will be in a better position to administer their trust, end quote. Inside back page advert, Williams, the Negro in the Caribbean. End footnote. Members of the International African Service Bureau gained considerable agitational experience by writing letters and articles for outside publications, and by organizing several small marches in the spring of 1938 against British imperialism. Footnote. See Consuelo Lopez's unpublished dissertation with Indiana University in 1983, C.L.R. James, The Rhetoric of a Defiant Warrior. End footnote. They organized a study group and also managed to produce a journal, International African Opinion, that appeared on an irregular basis. Containing short articles on a variety of topics pertaining to anti-colonial movements and events organized by the Bureau. Perhaps their most characteristic activity was addressing skeptical audiences at Hyde Park's famed Speaker's Corner. Different members of the Bureau took turns in declaiming on behalf of black rights. Ras McConan liked to start his speech by calling for, quote, war, because, quote, it's the only way we are going to get our rights, end quote. Footnote. McConan, page 119. McConan continues, quote, then after stirring them up for an hour, one would end with, quote, now you know it is against the law to sell papers or to ask for aid, but all the things we have just been talking about and much more are right here in our paper, International African Opinion. So end quote. So sometimes I would clear more than 20 pounds worth in a single meeting, end quote. McConan. End footnote. According to Wikipedia, wait, this isn't the right one. T. Ras McConan lived from 1909 to 1983 and was a Guyanese-born Pan-African activist of Ethiopian descent. The others could be equally brazen in their rhetoric, but James was the only Marxist. James would often walk to the nearby Trotskyist soapbox and rip into Stalinism after lecturing on the coming collapse of the British Empire for the Pan-Africanists. The IASB was undoubtedly the most militant of the various black organizations operating out of Britain. For example, the London-based League of Colored Peoples, founded in 1931 by a Jamaican, Harold Moody, sought to, quote, make representations to government authorities, hospital managements, medical facilities, commercial concerns, end quote, and other influential bodies, quote, on behalf of colored people in Britain, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Howitt, Leary Constantine, page 78, a useful source on Padmore, James, the IASB, and the League of Colored Peoples is Emmanuel Geis's The Pan-African Movement, A History of Pan-Africanism in America, Europe, and Africa, published with Africana Publishing in 1974. Wikipedia says the League of Colored Peoples was a British civil rights organization that was founded in 1931 in London by Jamaican-born physician and campaigner Harold Moody with the goal of racial equality around the world, a primary focus being on black rights in Britain. In 1933, the organization began publication of the civil rights journal, The Keys. The League of Colored Peoples was a powerful civil rights force until its dissolution in 1951. Wikipedia says Harold Arundel Moody lived from 1882 to 1947 and was a Jamaican-born physician who emigrated to the United Kingdom, where he campaigned against racial prejudice and established the League of Colored Peoples in 1931 with the support of the Quakers. End footnote. Back to the text. End footnote. Similar organizations... Wait, no, I didn't look up that book. I wanted to look that book up. Not seeing any good descriptions, but the best I see is The Pan-African Movement, A History of Pan-Africanism in America, Europe, and Africa. The description says, chronicles and examines the origins, development, directions, and leaders of Pan-Africanism and African nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries in Africa, America, and Europe. Back to the text. Similar organizations included the African Association, founded in 1897, and the African Progress Union, founded in 1921. Although James contributed to Moody's publication, The Keys, and gave a formal presentation on developments in the West Indies to members of the League, James's own sensibility was more accurately reflected by the IASB's impatient agenda. The active core of the IASB was comprised of a remarkable circle of West Indian intellectuals and future leaders of post-colonial Africa. The group's advocacy of African independence was both honorable and prescient, as Pan-Africanism was to become a potent force for change in the late 1940s. Pan-Africanism had been first proposed as a political philosophy, emphasizing black unity, consciousness, and autonomy by a Trinidadian lawyer, Henry Sylvester Williams, at the end of the 19th century. Wikipedia says Henry Sylvester Williams lived from 1867 to 1911. He was a Trinidadian lawyer, activist, counselor, and writer who was among the founders of the Pan-African movement. As a young man, Henry Sylvester Williams traveled to the United States and Canada to further Henry Sylvester Williams' education before subsequently moving to England, where Henry Sylvester Williams founded the African Association in 1897. To, quote, promote and protect the interests of all subjects claiming African descent, wholly or in part in British colonies and other places, especially Africa, by circulating accurate information on all subjects affecting their rights and privileges as subjects of the British Empire by direct appeals to the imperial and local governments, end quote. In 1900, Williams organized the first Pan-African Congress held at Westminster Town Hall in London. In 1903, he went on to practice as a barrister in southern Africa, becoming the first black man to be called to the bar in the Cape Colony. Back to the text. As a doctrine, Pan-Africanism served to underscore the dispersed character of the African peoples, the inherently unjust nature of slavery and oppression, and the need for an independent black leadership that could establish a black-centered agenda. The hope was that Pan-Africanism, as a philosophy and as a social movement, could generate a distinctive perspective on the black condition that would ultimately transform world politics. Sylvester Williams brought together 30 West Indians, African Americans, and Africans in London in 1900 for the first of 6, thus far, Pan-African Congresses. Wikipedia says the Pan-African Congress is a regular series of meetings which first took place on the back of the Pan-African Conference held in London in 1900. The Pan-African Congress first gained a reputation as a peacemaker for decolonization in Africa and in the West Indies and made a significant advance for the Pan-African cause. In the beginning, one of the group's major demands was to end colonial rule and racial discrimination. It stood against imperialism and it demanded human rights and equality of economic opportunity. The manifesto given by the Pan-African Congress included the political and economic demands of the Congress for a new world context of international cooperation and the need to address the issues facing Africa as a result of European colonization of most of the continent. Congresses have taken place in 1919 in Paris, 1921 in Brussels, London and Paris, 1923 in Lisbon and London, 1927 in New York City, 1945 in Manchester, 1974 in Dar es Salaam, 1994 in Kampala, and 2014 Back to the text. One of the delegates, the prominent sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, organized 3 further conferences in the 1910s and 1920s. Initially, the rhetoric of Pan-Africanism was less militant than Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement, refusing to adopt the oppositional tone of Garveyism. The first 4 Pan-African congresses called on the West to disengage from colonial practices out of a sense of both fair play and self-interest. The 5th Pan-African Congress, organized in 1945 by George and Dorothy Padmore, pushed the movement leftwards when it issued a call for the ousting of the colonial authorities through the popular mobilization of the African and Caribbean masses. By preparing the intellectual and organizational groundwork for an anti-colonialism based on a more radical grassroots perspective, the Padmores and the IASB helped shape the language and tactics of post-war anti-colonialism. The 6th Pan-African Congress, which furnished additional evidence of Pan-Africanism's evolution in a militantly populist and leftist direction, was held in Africa in 1974, partly at James's urging. The possibility of linking revolutionary politics in Europe and the colonies was perhaps uppermost on James's mind, as James worked on a manuscript that encompassed all of the important questions for facing the Pan-African and revolutionary movements. The San Domingo Revolution. At the end of the 18th century, San Domingo was a jewel in the crown of French colonialism. A highly organized and finely stratified society, San Domingo was one of several Caribbean colonies to make a decisive contribution to the making of the modern world economy. Over 500,000 slaves worked on the plantations and farms that dotted the island. In 1791, inspired by the radical republicanism of the French Revolution and aided by the sharp political divisions that had emerged within the ranks of the local elite, large numbers of slaves rose up in revolt, taking over farms and sending whites fleeing to port cities on the island's western edge. Out of the chaos of localized revolt emerged a number of armed gangs and factions consisting primarily of ex-slaves. Under the astute leadership of Toussaint L'Ouverture, a 45-year-old former head steward on a large estate, several of these gangs merged to form a mobile army. This fighting force engaged a succession of European military expeditions in combat and came to provide a measure of political stability and cohesion in many areas of San Domingo. Toussaint L'Ouverture took responsibility for designing a legal code, appointing regional administrators, reorganizing the system of taxation, and reviving the plantation economy on the basis of free labor. In 1803, Toussaint's army decisively defeated Napoleon Bonaparte's final invasion force, and so on January 1st, 1804, the new state of Haiti, Haiti being an Arawak Indian word for mountains, was born amid the wreckage of French colonialism. As the world's only successful slave revolution, the San Domingo uprising was above all a dramatic event. Indeed, James first presented the fruits of his historical research in the form of a play, titled Toussaint L'Ouverture, which was performed in 1936 in London, with the renowned American singer Paul Robeson in the title role. Footnote: despite their political differences, Robeson was put close to the Communist Party. Robeson made a lasting impression on James. Robeson was a kind of living combination of Bondman and Haynes, popular but never vulgar. Robeson was a well-spoken individual, but he carried himself like a star, not like an aesthete or an intellectual. See C.L.R. James's article, Paul Robeson, Black Star, published in 1970, reprinted in Spheres of Existence. End footnote. Let me see if there's anything on Toussaint L'Ouverture, the play. It's still in existence. According to Wikipedia, Toussaint L'Ouverture, the story of the only successful slave revolt in history, is a 3-act play about Toussaint L'Ouverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, which occurred from 1791 to 1804. It was written by C.L.R. James. Back to the text. The play focused on the complicated diplomatic maneuvers that took place between the revolutionary generals led by Toussaint L'Ouverture and the elegant French, British, and American ambassadors. While Toussaint was courteous in his dealings with the emissaries of colonialism, his aide, General Dessalines, was more blunt. The diplomats, he suggested, only wanted, quote, land for plantations and slaves to work, end quote. Wikipedia says Jean-Jacques Dessalines lived from 1758 to 1806, with the first Haitian emperor, leader of the Haitian Revolution, and the first ruler of an independent Haiti under the 1805 Constitution. Initially regarded as a governor-general, Dessalines was later named Emperor of Haiti as Jacques I, 1804 to 1806, by generals of the Haitian Revolutionary Army, and ruled in that capacity until being assassinated in 1806. Jean-Jacques Dessalines spearheaded the resistance against French rule of San Domingo and eventually became the architect of the 1804 massacre of the remaining French residents of newly independent Haiti, including some supporters of the revolution. Along with Toussaint L'Ouverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines had been referred to as one of the fathers of the nation of Haiti. Dessalines was directly responsible for the country, and under his rule, Haiti became the first country in the Americas to permanently abolish slavery. Dessalines served as an officer in the French army when San Domingo was fending off Spanish and British incursions. Later, Dessalines rose to become a commander in the revolt against France. As Toussaint Louverture's principal lieutenant, Jean-Jacques Dessalines led many successful engagements, including the Battle of Crête-à-Pierrot. In 1802, Louverture was betrayed and captured and sent to prison in France, where he died. Thereafter, Dessalines became the leader of the revolution and general-chef de l'armée indigène on the 18th of May, 1803. Jean-Jacques Dessalines' forces defeated the French army at the Battle of Vertières on the 18th of November, 1803. San Domingo was declared independent on the 29th of November, and then as the Independent Republic of Haiti on the 1st of January, 1804, under the leadership of Dessalines, chosen by a council of generals to assume the office of Governor-General. Jean-Jacques Dessalines ordered the 1804 Haitian massacre of the remaining French population in Haiti, resulting in the deaths of between 3,000 and 5,000 people, including women and children, and an exodus of thousands of refugees. Some modern historians classify the massacre as a genocide due to its systematic nature. Notably, Jean-Jacques Dessalines excluded surviving Polish legionnaires who had defected from the French Legion to become allied with the enslaved Africans, as well as the Germans who did not take part in the slave trade. Jean-Jacques Dessalines granted them full citizenship under the Constitution and classified them as black, along with all other Haitian citizens. Tensions remained with the minority of mixed race or free people of color, who had gained some education and property during the colonial period. As Emperor, Dessalines enforced plantation labor to promote the economy and began a dictatorship. In 1806, Dessalines was assassinated by members of his own administration and dismembered by a violent mob shortly thereafter. For much of the 19th century, Dessalines was generally reviled by Haitians for his autocratic ways. But by the beginning of the 20th century, Dessalines began to be reassessed as an icon of Haitian nationalism. The national anthem of Haiti, La Dessalinienne, written in 1903, is named in his honor. Back to the text. The Toussaint L'Ouverture play notes that Toussaint was eventually imprisoned on Napoleon's orders. Toussaint was abducted onto a French warship and transported to France, where Toussaint was imprisoned and later died, and that General Dessalines was compelled to lead the San Domingo ex-slave army to victory in Toussaint's absence. Dessalines was crowned Emperor Jacques I, the first sovereign ruler of Haiti, in October 1804. The themes of the latter, the Black Jacobins, the movements towards self-emancipation on part of the slaves, the strained relations between slaves and mulattoes, the fragile link between the West Indian freedom fighters and the partisans of the French Revolution, the conjunction of diplomacy and mass insurrection, were all richly dramatized for a London theater-going audience. Footnote: although the play received decent notices, the theater critic for the London Sunday Times found that, quote, Mr. James's dialogue is informative rather than suggestive. It lacks suppleness, end quote, but also admitted that, quote, having an interesting subject, it holds the stage at the Westminster Theatre, end quote. Quoted in James's article, Paul Robeson. A revised version of the play adapted by Dexter Lindersay and C.L.R. James is reprinted under the title The Black Jacobins in Anna Grinshaw's edited volume, The C.L.R. James Reader. Back to the text and footnote. End footnote. Within 2 years, Zecker and Warburg had brought out the Black Jacobins. Back to the text. The book's central thesis concerns the centrality of the slave's purposive action in undermining slavery and the plantation system in San Domingo. The aim of the book was to show how West Indian slavery was abolished not by humanitarian gestures or legislative decrees, but by the collective mobilization of slaves, particularly those in revolutionary Haiti. It was the threat of similar revolts, James argued, that compelled Europe's politicians and civil servants to finally outlaw slavery. As a crucial passage in the book asks, quote, but when did property ever listen to reason except when cowed by violence, end quote. James, The Black Jacobins, page 70. This is not to suggest that James regarded violence as a panacea. James goes out of his way to emphasize that Toussaint's skills encompassed the arts of negotiation, mediation, and compromise, and the fact that from its inception Haiti was handicapped by Toussaint's captivity and death as an exiled prisoner of the French state, Toussaint's absence, and the eclipse of radical republicanism, i.e. Jacobinism, in revolutionary France, helped deprive an independent Haiti of the leadership it required, or of any substantial outside economic or technical assistance. The text is peppered with references to the prospects for analogous uprisings in modern Africa. In a 1975 interview, James said that The Black Jacobins was written to show, quote, how the African Revolution would develop, end quote. The book's conclusion emphasizes that, quote, those black Haitian laborers, end quote, have, quote, given us an ample example to study, end quote. Quote, despite the temporary reaction of fascism, the prevailing standards of human liberty and equality are infinitely more advanced and more profound than those current in 1789. Judged relatively by those standards, the millions of blacks in Africa, and the few of them who are educated, are as much pariahs in that vast prison as the blacks and mulattoes of San Domingo. Imperialism vaunts its exploitation of the wealth of Africa for the benefit of civilization. In reality, from the very nature of its system of production for profit, it strangles the real wealth of the continent, the creative capacity of the African people. The African faces a long and difficult road and will need guidance, but he will tread it fast because he will walk upright. End quote. James, The Black Jacobins, pages 375 to 377. The book's preoccupation with the question of African independence may be explained, in part, by a point that James emphasized in its 1963 appendix, quote, before they, West Indians, could begin to see themselves as free and independent people, they had to clear from, their, minds, the stigma that anything African was inherently inferior and degraded. The road to West Indian national identity lay through Africa, end quote. James, The Black Jacobins, page 402. Unless otherwise noted, all emphases are in the original as they are here. The appendix entitled From Toussaint L'Ouverture to Fidel Castro is reprinted in Anna Grimshaw's edited volume, The C.L.R. James Reader. End footnote. Although this point was only made explicit in an essay written a quarter century after the book was first published, we must assume that even in the late 1930s, James is broadly sympathetic to the notion that, as he so elegantly put it, that, quote, the road to West Indian national identity lay through Africa, end quote. Yet in this earlier period, sub-Saharan Africa represented above all a strategic linchpin in the international revolutionary process. It would be misleading to suppose that James was as interested in the question of, quote, national identity, end quote, in the late 1930s as James would later become in the early 1960s. James's uppermost concern in the earlier period would have been in the political dynamics of, and prospects for, world revolution, while the formation of a West Indian national identity was not an entirely separate issue for James. It was at this juncture far from being his top priority. Footnote. Note that James writes, quote, West Indian rather than, quote, Caribbean. This may have reflected his own sense of identity, which was decisively shaped by British colonialism, Trinidadian mores and practices, the English and French high culture. In this context, it's perhaps significant that James spoke English and French, but never learned Spanish or Haitian Creole. End footnote. It was a hallmark of Pan-African thought to draw connections between struggles in the Old World and the New. By its very nature, Pan-Africanism was concerned with linking movements across the diaspora and with the exchange of ideas, personnel, and tactical advice across national and regional boundaries. In this sense, Pan-Africanism shared an internationalist character in common with Marxism. Decisively shaped by the author's newly acquired Marxism and Trotskyism, the radical internationalism of the Black Jacobins vividly distinguished it from comparable works. As Cedric Jameson notes, other Pan-African texts published in the 1930s and 1940s. He cites James Padmore's How Britain Rules Africa, published in 1936, Eric Williams' The Negro in the Caribbean, published in 1942, and Jomo Kenyatta's Kenya, Land of Conflict, published in 1945, quote, were addressed to the colonial powers, end quote. In contrast, the Black Jacobins, quote, was a declaration of war for liberation, end quote. Wikipedia says Cedric James Robinson lived from 1940 to 2016. Cedric Robinson was an American professor in the Department of Black Studies and the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Cedric Robinson headed the Department of Black Studies and the Department of Political Science. Cedric Robinson serves as the director of the Center for Black Studies Research. Cedric Robinson's areas of interest included classical and modern political philosophy, radical social theory in the African diaspora, comparative politics, racial capitalism, and the relationships between and among media and politics. Back to the text. Footnote. Cedric J. Robinson, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, published with Zed Books, 1983, and Kenyatta's Land of Conflict was published with the IASB. In this ambitious book, first published in 1983, Cedric Robinson demonstrates that efforts to understand Black people's history of resistance solely through the prism of Marxist theory was incomplete and inaccurate. Marxist analyses tend to presuppose European models of history and experience that downplay the significance of Black people and Black communities as agents of change and resistance. Black radicalism, Robinson argues, must be linked to the traditions of Africa and the unique experiences of blacks on Western continents, and any analysis of African American history need to acknowledge this. To illustrate his argument, Robinson traces the emergence of Marxist ideology in Europe, the resistance by blacks in historically oppressive environments, and the influence of both these traditions on such important 20th-century black radical thinkers as W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and Richard Wright. This revised and updated third edition includes a new preface by Tiffany Willoughby Harold and a new foreword by Robin D.G. Kelly. Back to the text and footnote. In addition to being a manifesto and primer for the coming African uprising, the Black Jacobins was intended to demonstrate the applicability of Marxist analysis and Marxist categories to social change in what later became known as the Third World. The book's chapter titles, The Owners, The San Domingo Masses Begin, and The Paris Masses Complete, The Bourgeois Prepares to Restore Slavery, etc., confirm the author's conflict-centered class-analytical perspective. In addition, the centrality of international capitalist relations in shaping political relations in the colonies is assumed. Following Marx's own approach, capitalism is described in the book as a dynamic and totalizing system which imposes its profit-maximizing logic on both states and individual actors. Furthermore, questions of political and military organization and leadership, a salient dimension of Lenin and Trotsky's interpretation of Marxism, are considered in great detail. An essentially dialectical relationship is posited between the spontaneity expressed by the San Domingo masses and the forging of a revolutionary vanguard under the leadership of Toussaint L'Ouverture. James's one criticism of this, quote, master of the art of war and skillful negotiator, end quote, was that Toussaint failed to trust the masses with his inner thoughts. Footnote: James, Black Jacobins. Jack Blackabins. That'd be me. Jack Black. That's a funny guy. Sorry. Furthermore, questions of political and military organization and leadership, a salient dimension of Lenin and Trotsky's interpretation of Marxism, are considered in great detail. An essentially dialectical relationship is posited between... where the hell am I? I've started reading in the wrong place. Between the spontaneity expressed by the San Domingo masses and the forging of a revolutionary vanguard under the leadership of Toussaint L'Ouverture. James's one criticism of this master of the art of war and skillful negotiator was that Toussaint failed to trust the masses with his inner thoughts. Quote, Toussaint ignored the black laborers, and to bewilder the masses is to strike the deadliest of all blows to the revolution, end quote. As a biographer, James saw this lack of trust as Toussaint L'Ouverture's tragic flaw. As Edward Said writes, quote, Toussaint is drawn by James as an admirable man, non-vindictive, immensely intelligent, subtle, and yet perfectly responsive to the suffering of his fellow Haitians. Great men make history, says James, quote, but only such history as it is possible for them to make, end quote. Toussaint rarely took his people into his confidence, bracket, however, end bracket, ... end quote. See Edward Said's article, Third World Intellectuals and Metropolitan Culture, published in Raritan, Volume 9, Number 3, Winter 1990, page 44. End footnote. The evidence makes it clear that Toussaint remained faithful to the example and to the declared representatives of the French Revolution. It is Toussaint, rather than his army, who is the authentic, quote, Black Jacobin. Yet one of the book's central themes concerns the way in which a wider link opened between the most radical elements of the French Revolution and the San Domingo Rebellion. In the midst of social and political upheaval, an objective connection was disclosed between two very different subordinate groups in two distinct contexts. The events in France provided the slaves of San Domingo with an opportunity. Fissures within the local white elite and into ideological rationale, that is, republicanism. At the same time, the slave rebellion in San Domingo was an inspiration to radicals in France. The cause of Haitian independence was aided considerably when the French Assembly, under pressure from the radical Jacobins, abolished slavery, or, quote, the aristocracy of the skin, end quote, in the French colonies. James wrote, quote, on the 11th of August, the day after the Tuileries fell, Page, a notorious agent of the colonialists in France, wrote home almost in despair, quote, one spirit alone reigns here. It is horror of slavery and enthusiasm for liberty. It is a frenzy which wins all heads and grows every day, end quote. Henceforth the Paris masses were for abolition, and their black brothers in San Domingo, for the first time, had passionate allies in France, end quote. James, the Black Jacobins. It was only the overthrow of Jacobinism, which commenced on the day of the Thermidor, July 27th, 1794, that the connection between the two revolutions would be severed. Henceforth, France would once more take up arms to defend her, quote, property. It was under the leadership of the great consolidator, Napoleon Bonaparte, that the French military attempted to restore slavery in her most recalcitrant colony, with no success. James's emphasis on the international repercussions of civil war was written in the spirit of Marx's own comparative historical sociology. But the Black Jacobins specifically drew on Leon Trotsky's analysis of, quote, permanent revolution, which stipulated that successful rebellions in the developing nations would quickly pass through the stage of bourgeois democracy to the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, while revolutions in, quote, backward nations, in Trotsky's view, could play a catalytic role vis-a-vis developments in advanced nations. Isolated revolutions would fail as long as they lacked material and political support from workers in the West. Footnote. See Leon Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution, originally published in 1928 and republished in 1969 with Pathfinder. See also Alex Kalinikos' article, Trotsky's Theory of Permanent Revolution and its Relevance to the Third World Today, published in International Socialism, number 16, spring 1982, and Robin Blackburn, The Overthrow of Colonial Slavery, published with Verso in 1988. I'm going to look up that last book. The Verso description of this book says, one of the finest studies of slavery and abolition. It's a quote from Eric Foner, and the description says, in 1770, a handful of European nations ruled the Americas, drawing from them a stream of products, both everyday and exotic, some 2.5 million black slaves, imprisoned in plantation colonies, toiled to produce the sugar, coffee, cotton, ginger, and indigo craved by Europeans. By 1848, the major system of colonial slavery had been swept away either by the independence movements, slave revolts, abolitionists, or some combination of all three. How did this happen? Robin Blackburn's history captures the complexity of a revolutionary age in a compelling narrative. In some cases, colonial rule fell while slavery flourished, as happened in the south of the United States and in Brazil. Elsewhere, slavery ended, but colonial rule remained, as in the British West Indies and French Windwards. But in French San Domingo, the future Haiti, and in Spanish South and Central America, both colonialism and slavery were defeated. This story of slave liberation and American independence highlights the pivotal role of the, quote, first emancipation in the French Antilles in the 1790s, the parallel actions of slave resistance and metropolitan abolitionism, and the contradictory implications of slaveholder patriotism. The dramatic events of this epoch are examined from an unexpected vantage point, showing how the torch of anti-slavery passed from the medieval communes to dissident Quakers, from African Maroons to radical pirates, from Granville Sharp and Ottaba Cugoano to Toussaint L'Ouverture, from the Black Jacobins to the liberators of South America, from the African Baptists in Jamaica to the revolutionaries of 1848 in Europe and the Caribbean. Back to the text and footnote. What the Haitian events suggested was the revolutionary alliance fashioned across national and racial boundaries were a genuine historical possibility. It was, James believed, the degeneration of the French Revolution, rather than of the San Domingo Revolution, which deprived Haiti of the resources that Haiti needed to protect itself against an international system predicated on primitive capitalist accumulation. The Black Jacobins should not be read as saying that a global socialist order could have been created at the close of the 18th century, but the Black Jacobins authors certainly meant to suggest that the general dynamics identified by the theory of, quote, permanent revolution came into play in an epoch when slavery and capitalism were most closely intertwined. While the Black Jacobins was not specifically concerned with the nexus of slavery and capitalism, the Black Jacobins did help inspire Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, which was published in 1944. Capitalism and Slavery is currently published with University of North Carolina Press, and the description says, slavery helped finance the Industrial Revolution in England. Plantation owners, shipbuilders, and merchants connected with the slave trade accumulated vast fortunes that established banks and heavy industry in Europe and expanded the reach of capitalism worldwide. Eric Williams advanced these powerful ideas in Capitalism and Slavery, published in 1944. Years ahead of his profound critique became the foundation for studies of imperialism and economic development, binding an economic view of history with strong moral argument. Williams' study of the role of slavery in financing the Industrial Revolution refuted traditional ideas of economic and moral progress and firmly established the centrality of the African slave trade in European economic development. Eric Williams also showed that mature industrial capitalism in turn helped destroy the slave system, establishing the exploitation of commercial capitalism and its link to racial attitudes. Williams employed a historicist vision that set the tone for future studies. Back to the text. While the Black Jacobins was not specifically concerned with the nexus of slavery and capitalism, it did help inspire Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, which was published in 1944, 2 years after Williams' first book, The Negro in the Caribbean, appeared in print. Based on a dissertation Williams defended in the late 1930s at Oxford University, Capitalism and Slavery focused on British colonialism and sought to demonstrate that slavery was ended not by abolitionism but by rational self-interest. Williams met with his former tutor on numerous occasions when both were living in Britain, and it seems that James both read drafts of the dissertation and had a significant role in formulating the book's primary thesis. Footnote. On this point, see Robert Hill's article, In England, 1932 to 1938, in Bull, edited volume, C.L.R. James's Life and Work. End footnote. Of all of Williams' work, this was the book that registered the greatest impact on both scholarly and popular audiences. Footnote. On Williams' career as a historian, see Paul Sutton's article, The Historian as Politician, Eric Williams and Walter Rodney, in Alastair Hennessy's edited volume, Intellectuals in the 20th Century Caribbean, Volume 1, Spectre of the New Class, The Commonwealth Caribbean, published with Macmillan Caribbean, 1992, and Selwyn Cudjoe's article, Eric E. Williams and the Politics of Language, in the book Eric E. Williams Speaks, Essays on Colonialism and Independence. So let's look these books up. I'm not seeing any description for the Alastair Hennessy book, Intellectuals in the 20th Century Caribbean. The description for Essays on Colonialism and Independence, Eric E. Williams Speaks, Essays on Colonialism and Independence. The description is very short. It just says, collection of speeches and articles by the late Eric Williams, along with a few other contributions, reveals Williams to be a consummate scholar and politician, as well as charismatic leader who pursued politics of change in the Caribbean. Back to the text and footnote. However, it should be noted that Williams' approach differs from Williams' tutors in several important respects. Eric Williams' account stresses purely economic factors, in particular the substitution of tenant and industrial labor for slave labor as a function of economic calculation. Unlike the Black Jacobins, capitalism and slavery does not survey its historical terrain from the perspective of the masses, and its author effectively discounts the role of self-emancipatory struggles in undermining slavery. Given their subsequent personal histories, one a socialist and internationalist, the other a post-colonial politician, this contrast between the two books is revealing. Their stylistic and political differences were underscored by the publication of a short companion volume to the Black Jacobins that surveyed black protest movements in Africa, the United States, and the Caribbean, entitled A History of Negro Revolt. I'm not really seeing any good description. Wait, might be something on Google Books. All right. A History of Pan-African Revolt by C.L.R. James. A welcome reissue of the pioneering work on black resistance with a superb new introduction by Robin D.G. Kelley. Quote, no piece of literature can substitute for a crystal ball, and only religious fundamentalists believe that a book can provide comprehensive answers to all questions. But if nothing else, A History of Pan-African Revolt leaves us with two incontrovertible facts. First, as long as black people are denied freedom, humanity, and a decent standard of living, they will continue to revolt. Second, unless these revolts involve the ordinary masses and take place on their own terms, they have no hope of succeeding, end quote. From the introduction by Robin D.G. Kelley. End footnote. Or back to the text and footnote. Well, actually, there was no footnote. I'm sorry. Just back to the text. Williams would have been incapable of producing such a class-conscious document, and Williams' fastidious empiricism probably would have prevented Williams from advancing the kinds of sweeping claims that James makes throughout this book. It is doubtful, for example, that Williams would have dismissed Marcus Garvey's doctrines as, quote, pitiable rubbish, end quote, declared that between the blacks and Indo-Caribbeans of Trinidad, quote, there is no racial ill feeling. Quote, there is no racial ill feeling, end quote. Or suggested that the sectarian creed of the Watchtower movement, Jehovah's Witnesses, quote, primitively approximates to the dialectic of Marx and Lenin, end quote. Weird. While A History of Negro Revolt contained a massive information that would have been new to its readers and makes a strong case for the ubiquity of black resistance, the pamphlet is marred by a distracting degree of sloppiness both at the level of presentation and theory. Nevertheless, through public speeches, books, and articles, James made a singular contribution to the Pan-African cause in the 1930s. What distinguished James's voice from that of, say, Jomo Kenyatta, whose rhetorical militancy amassed a refusal to engage in socialist politics, or even George Padmore, who retained a broad commitment to socialist ideals, was that it bore the hallmark of a consciously historical materialist and Trotskyist conception of politics and history. Jomo Kenyatta lived between 1897 and 1978. Jomo Kenyatta was a Kenyan anti-colonial activist and politician who governed Kenya as its prime minister from 1963 to 1964, and then as its first president from 1964 to his death in 1978. Jomo Kenyatta played a significant role in the transformation of Kenya from a colony of the British Empire into an independent republic. Ideologically an African nationalist and a conservative, Jomo Kenyatta led the Kenya African National Union (KNU) party from 1961 until his death. Jomo Kenyatta was born to Kikuyu farmers in Kiambu, British East Africa. Educated at a mission school, Jomo Kenyatta worked in various jobs before becoming politically engaged through the Kikuyu Central Association. In 1929, Jomo Kenyatta traveled to London to lobby for Kikuyu land affairs. During the 1930s, he studied at Moscow's Communist University of the Toilers of the East, University College London, and the London School of Economics. In 1938, Jomo Kenyatta published an anthropological study of Kikuyu life before working as a farm laborer in Sussex during the Second World War. Influenced by his friend George Padmore, Jomo Kenyatta embraced anti-colonialist and Pan-African ideas, co-organizing the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester. Jomo Kenyatta returned to Kenya in 1946 and became a school principal. In 1947, Jomo Kenyatta was elected president of the Kenya African Union, through which he lobbied for independence from British colonial rule, attracting widespread indigenous support but animosity from white settlers. In 1952, Jomo Kenyatta was among the Kepenguria Six, arrested and charged with masterminding the anti-colonial Mau Mau uprising. Although protesting Jomo Kenyatta's innocence, a view shared by later historians, Jomo Kenyatta was convicted. Jomo Kenyatta remained imprisoned at Lokitwang until 1959, and then was exiled to Lodwar until 1961. On his release, Jomo Kenyatta became president of KANU and led the party to victory in the 1963 general election. As Prime Minister, Jomo Kenyatta oversaw the transition of the Kenya colony into an independent republic, of which he became president in 1964. Desiring a one-party state, Jomo Kenyatta transferred regional powers to his central government, suppressed political dissent, and prohibited KANU's only rival, Odinga's leftist Kenya People's Union, from competing in elections. Jomo Kenyatta promoted reconciliation between the country's indigenous ethnic groups and its European minority, although his relations with the Kenyan Indians were strained and Kenya's army clashed with Somali separatists in the northeastern province during the Shifta War. Jomo Kenyatta's government pursued capitalist economic policies and the, quote, Africanization, end quote, of the economy, prohibiting non-citizens from controlling key industries. Education and healthcare were expanded, while UK-funded land redistribution favored KANU loyalists and exacerbated ethnic tensions. Under Kenyatta, Kenya joined the Organization of African Unity and the Commonwealth of Nations, espoused a pro-Western and anti-communist foreign policy amid the Cold War. Jomo Kenyatta died in office and was succeeded by Daniel Arap Moi. Jomo Kenyatta's son Uhuru later became president. Jomo Kenyatta was a controversial figure. Prior to Kenyan independence, many of Kenya's white settlers regarded Jomo Kenyatta as an agitator and malcontent, although across Africa, Jomo Kenyatta gained widespread respect as an anti-colonialist. During Jomo Kenyatta's presidency, Jomo Kenyatta was given the honorary title of Mzee and lauded as the father of the nation, securing support from both the black majority and the white minority with his message of reconciliation. Conversely, Jomo Kenyatta's rule was criticized as dictatorial, authoritarian, and neocolonial, of favoring Kikuyu over other ethnic groups and of facilitating the growth of widespread corruption. So that's who Jomo Kenyatta is, according to Wikipedia. Back to the text. In the early 1930s, the maverick Trotskyists offered a pugnaciously Marxist alternative to capital C communism, anarchism, and social democracy. But how did James reconcile Pan-Africanism with Pan-Africanism's proto-Third Worldist approach to politics with Trotskyism? Revolutionary socialism may have seemed far removed from Pan-Africanism, but for James the two were complementary. Trotskyism anticipated the emergence of new revolutionary movements in the coming period, and Trotskyism placed a critical emphasis on the importance of linking and extending radical struggles across national borders. Permanent revolution, Trotsky's theory of the interpenetration of radical movements in the core and periphery of the world system, conveniently, and for James persuasively arranged world historic forces in such a way as to allow for the complete and secure abolition of colonialism and imperialism. Trotsky's own remarkable biography and corpus proved to be tremendous assets to the Trotskyist movement in its efforts to attract new members. The Russian-born theorist of permanent revolution was, after all, more than just another anti-bourgeois utopian. Leon Trotsky had written penetrating histories of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. Trotsky had commanded the victorious Red Army. Trotsky was an astute literary and social critic, and Trotsky had been the leader of the Petrograd Soviet in 1905. Trotsky was as widely known for his brilliant oratory as for Trotsky's support of the Soviets, the Workers' Councils of 1905 and 1917. Trotsky was also a steadfast opponent of Stalinism, who had been deported from the Soviet Union in January 1929, stripped of his citizenship and placed in great physical danger. Trotsky's personal charisma was great, and the old man's magnetism only increased on the printed page. For someone like James, who was new to the revolutionary movement, Trotskyism promised to fuse theory and practice through the creation of a genuinely revolutionary international vanguard that could decisively intervene in the struggles of the day. The fact that the Trotskyists oriented themselves around the movements of the industrial working class was wholly acceptable to James, since James had been impressed by the militant and democratic trade unionism James saw put into practice in the West Indies and England. When James moved to London in 1934, James came into contact with Trotskyists in the Hampstead branch of the Independent Labour Party and quickly joined their ranks. Because of his erudition and political skills, he was catapulted into the leadership of the Marxist group, one of the smaller British Trotskyist groupings, within a matter of weeks. At the time, the organization had a few dozen members concentrated in London. Footnote: Harry Wicks, who was active in Trotskyist politics, later testified that the Marxist group, quote, won over people of a very impressive caliber, end quote, including, quote, C.L.R. James, a West Indian brilliant speaker, with tremendous energy, end quote. cited in Duncan Hallis's article, Revolutionaries and the Labour Party, published in International Socialism number 16. See also C.L.R. James and British Trotskyism, an interview, published with London Socialist Platform 1987. James and Wicks became friends in the 1930s, and Wicks' assistance is acknowledged in the introduction to James's 1937 book, World Revolution. According to Wikipedia, World Revolution 1917 to 1936, The Rise and Fall of the Communist International, was written by Trinidadian Marxist C.L.R. James and published in 1937 by Zecker and Warburg. World Revolution was a pioneering Marxist analysis from a Trotskyist perspective of the history of revolutions during the interwar period and of the fundamental conflict between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin after the Russian Revolution. James, who was a leading Trotskyist activist in Britain during the 1930s, outlined Russia's transition from communist revolution to a Stalinist totalitarian state. Bureaucracy, building on works such as Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed, James also provides an account of the ideological contestations within the Communist International while examining its influence on the development of the Soviet Union and its changing role in the struggles such as the German Revolution of 1918 to 1923, the Chinese Revolution of 1925 to 1927, and the Spanish Civil War. James was helped when writing it by Harry Wicks and other Trotskyists, while Dorothy Pitzer typed up the manuscript. The work was dedicated to the Marxist group, of which James was then a leading member. Outside of active communists like John Ross Campbell and Andrew Rothstein, who reviewed the book negatively, the book had a very good reception overall, with Trotsky in 1939 calling it, quote, a very good book, end quote. George Orwell in 1937 thought it, quote, a very able book, end quote, while E.H. Clark in 1937 called it decidedly useful in his analysis of the course of the Russian Revolution and of the point at which it took the wrong turning. Mr. James displays commendable independence of judgment and desire to arrive at the truth, end quote. The work was also critically praised by Fenner Brockway as well as Eugene Lyons. Among Trotskyists, the work made a considerable impact. Although the work was banned by British colonial authorities, it was smuggled into India, and G. Selvarajatna, later leader of the Great Strike in the Madras textile mills, was converted to Trotskyism upon reading it, and Leslie Gunawardena's Rise and Fall of the Comintern, published 10 years afterwards in Bombay, was largely based on it. An American edition was published by Pioneer Publications, New York, in 1937. The book was reprinted by Krauss in 1970, and Hyperion Press in 1973, and Humanities Press in 1992, with an introduction by Al Richardson. A new edition was produced in 2017 by Duke University Press to mark the centenary of the Russian Revolution. Back to the text. End footnote. The strategy of the Marxist group was to dominate the left wing of the Independent Labor Party and steer that organization in a revolutionary direction. Trotsky had initially endorsed their strategy, which went by the name of, quote, entryism, end quote, as in, quote, entering, end quote, a larger non-Trotskyist formation to recruit new members or to take over the organization. The Independent Labor Party, with its 17,000 members, had been targeted by the Trotskyists as the party was turning leftwards during the early years of the Depression. By 1935, however, Trotsky was urging his followers to pull out of the Independent Labor Party on the grounds that its leaders were wedded to parliamentary politics. Footnote. Quote, by the spring of 1935, at least, Trotsky had become convinced that the Independent Labor Party leadership and its international allies were hopeless as a revolutionary prospect. In truth, the Independent Labor Party leaders, who had managed to avoid joining the Communist Party even in 1920, were never such. The fact was now obvious, and Trotsky recognized it. A good many of his followers who were inside the Independent Labour Party were unwilling to accept this obvious conclusion and to split with their gains from that party, end quote. See Duncan Hollis, Revolutionaries, and the Labour Party. Again, that's a Cliffist, Trotskyist source. End footnote. End footnote. Despite Trotsky's advice, the Marxist group remained active in the Independent Labour Party, but the group was expelled in November 1936 for publishing its own factional paper titled Fight. James was fast becoming a well-known figure in this period. Several of James's pieces for the Independent Labour Party's magazine New Leader caused a stir among progressive circles. His first article for the Independent Labour Party was titled, Is This Worth a War? The League's scheme to rob Abyssinia of its independence, represented an important intervention in the debate about the left's response to Italy's military aggression. The debate hinged on the question of whether to support the League of Nations' call for economic sanctions against Italy. While the Labour Party supported sanctions, the Independent Labour Party was sharply divided over the issue. Many Independent Labour Partiers argued that under the rule of Haile Selassie, Abyssinia, like Italy, was a dictatorship. I'm reading some. What?
You have a 20? I mean a 10?
No.
I'm going to take the lottery ticket and cash it in for you.
Okay. Thank you. I got a lottery ticket for Christmas. Haile Selassie, born Tafari Makonnen, or Lij Tafari, lived from 1892 to 1975. How do you say this guy's name anyway?
Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie.
This politician was the Emperor of Ethiopia from 1930. Hello, Dr. Hansman here. This politician was the Emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 19 in Henrik Selassie. Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie. Selassie. Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie.
Haile Selassie, I guess is how you say his name. That's my guess. Haile Selassie lived from 1892 to 1975. Haile Selassie was Emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974. Haile Selassie rose to power as the regent plenipotentiary of Ethiopia, Enderasa, under Empress Zewditu between 1916 and 1930. Widely considered to be a defining figure in modern Ethiopian history, Haile Selassie is accorded divine importance in Rastafari, an Abrahamic religion that emerged in the 1930s. A few years before Haile Selassie began his reign over the Ethiopian Empire, Haile Selassie defeated Ethiopian army commander Ras Gugsa Wele Bitul, nephew of Empress Tatu Betul, at the Battle of Onhem. Haile Selassie belonged to the Solomonic dynasty founded by Emperor Yekuno Amlak in 1270. Amlak's successors claimed that he was a lineal descendant of Menelik I, the legendary emperor of Ethiopia, who was supposedly born to King Solomon and Queen Makeda of the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Sheba, respectively. Historians regard the Solomonic lineage claim as unfounded, created by Amlak to justify wresting power from the Zagwe dynasty. Haile Selassie, I don't know how to say it, seeking to modernize Ethiopia, introduced political and social reforms, including the 1931 Constitution and the abolition of slavery. He led the empire during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, and after his defeat was exiled to the United Kingdom. When the Italian occupation of East Africa began, Haile Selassie traveled to Anglo-Egyptian Sudan to coordinate the Ethiopian struggle against fascist Italy. Haile Selassie returned home after the East African campaign of World War II. Haile Selassie dissolved the Federation of Ethiopia and Eritrea and established by the United Nations General Assembly in 1950 and annexed Eritrea as one of Ethiopia's provinces, while also fighting to prevent Eritrean secession. As an internationalist, Selassie led Ethiopia's accession to the United Nations. In 1963, Haile Selassie presided over the formation of the Organization of African Unity, the precursor of the African Union, and served as its chairman. By the early 1960s, prominent African socialists such as Kwame Nkrumah envisioned the creation of a, quote, United States of Africa, end quote. Their rhetoric was anti-Western. Selassie saw this as a threat to his alliances. He attempted to influence a more moderate posture within the group. Amidst popular uprisings, Selassie was overthrown by the Derg in the 1974 Ethiopian coup d'etat. With support from the Soviet Union, the Derg began governing Ethiopia as a Marxist-Leninist state. In 1994, 3 years after the fall of the Derg military junta, it was revealed to the public that the Derg had assassinated Selassie at the Jubilee Palace in Addis Ababa on the 27th of August 1975. On the 5th of November 2000, Haile Selassie's excavated remains were buried at the Holy Trinity Cathedral of Addis Ababa. Among adherents of Rastafari, Selassie called the returned Jesus. Selassie was a Christian and adhered to the tenets of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Haile Selassie has been criticized for his suppression of rebellions among the landed aristocracy, Mesafint, which consistently opposed his changes. Others have criticized Ethiopia's failure to modernize rapidly enough. During Selassie's reign, the Harari people were persecuted and many left their homes. Selassie's administration was criticized as autocratic and illiberal by groups such as Human Rights Watch. According to some sources, late into Selassie's administration, the Oromo language was banned from education, public speaking, and use in administration, though there was never a law that criminalized any language. Selassie's government relocated many Amhara people into southern Ethiopia. Following the death of Ethiopian civil rights activist Akulu Hundessa in 2020, his bust in the United Kingdom was destroyed by Oromo-speaking protesters, and an equestrian monument depicting his father was removed from Harar. Back to the text. While the Labour Party supported sanctions, the Independent Labour Party was sharply divided over the issue. Many independent Labour parties argue that under the rule of Haile Selassie, Abyssinia, like Italy, was a dictatorship. They therefore took a neutral position on the question of sanctions. The Marxist group, on the other hand, called for independent proletarian action in defense of Abyssinia. James was largely responsible for articulating the group's position, and in one article, James exclaimed, quote, "Workers of Britain, peasants and workers of Africa, get closer together for this and for other fights. But keep far from the imperialists and their league and covenants and sanctions. Do not play the fly to their spider," end quote. James. Footnote. C.L.R. James article, "Is This Worth a War? The League's Scheme to Rob Abyssinia of Its Independence," published on October 4th, 1935, reprinted in C.L.R. James at the Rendezvous of History, Selected Writings. End footnote. At the Independent Labour Party's annual conference in 1936, James played a leading role in converting the party to the Marxist group's position on sanctions. Drawing on the precepts of Pan-Africanism, James, the Independent Labour Party, that Italy's invasion would spark an international opposition movement of immense proportions. Quote, "It is necessary to support the anti-imperialist mass movements arising among, quote, colored peoples in all countries in connection with the Abyssinian crisis, and to create a firm alliance between the international working class movement and suppressed peoples," end quote. C.L.R. James. James also took his message of, quote, class struggle Pan-Africanism, end quote, to Independent Labour Party meetings in South Wales, where James drew large and enthusiastic crowds. Footnote. At Neath Town Hall, James addressed over 150 Welsh rank-and-file trade unionists on the, quote, war danger. An Independent Labour Party member reported that, quote, despite the cold, the audience were absorbed in C.L.R. James's address, and everyone stayed right through to the end. There were only a couple of Communist partiers present, and whatever remaining shreds of influence they may have had in Neath melted under C.L.R.'s withering fire, end quote. Document on file at Houghton Library, Harvard University, BMS Russ, 3, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter. End footnote. Given his growing prominence within the Independent Labour Party, it is no wonder that the British historian Duncan Hallis, also Cliffist Trotskyist, has observed that James, quote, found that staying in the Independent Labour Party as it was in many ways suited his talented but individualistic personality, end quote. Footnote. Duncan Hallis, Revolutionaries in the Labour Party, page 18, end footnote. James's public reputation was cemented by his writings. He wrote a preface to a moving account of the Spanish Civil War, written by two English anti-Stalinists, one of them the surrealist poet Mary Lowe. Not seeing really anything good and simple for Mary Lowe. Moving on. One of them surrealist poet Mary Lowe, and contributed several pieces to Controversy, an Independent Labour Party-sponsored journal that maintained a broad-minded editorial policy. In addition, James's book, World Revolution, 1917 to 1936, which was dedicated to the Marxist group, left a lasting impression on the non-communist left, and in a letter to Trotsky, James explained that he hoped to stir up trouble inside the communist ranks. Quote, "We shall have a good basis for putting across our line. The Communist Party here is terribly frightened by the prospect, bracket, of publication, end bracket, for the Communist Party, more than anyone else, know that all that is to be said about their criminal policy during the last few years," end quote. Footnote. Letter from James to Leon Trotsky dated June 24, 1936. In a 1938 conversation with the writer James T. Farrell, however, James acknowledged that the Trotskyists were sometimes overly preoccupied with, quote, bookkeeping the theoretical errors of Stalinists, showing that Stalin does not understand Spain and on ad infinitum, end quote. Letter from James T. Farrell to Meyer Shapiro, May 28, 1938, contained in the Shapiro archives at the Rare Book Collection at Columbia University's Butler Library, end footnote. One communist reviewer did acknowledge that World Revolution was, quote, a masterpiece of political dementia, end quote. Footnote. Lunacy or Logic, Two Views of One Book, published in Controversy, Volume 1, Number 6, May 1937, end footnote. The book was banned by the British colonial authorities in India shortly after its publication. Footnote. Sam Bornstein and Al Richardson, Against the Stream, A History of the Trotskyist Movement in Britain, 1924 to 1938, end footnote. World Revolution, the book, presents a scathing and comprehensive critique of the Comintern's foreign policy under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, calling particular attention to, quote, crimes and, quote, blunders committed by the leadership of the international communist movement in the context of revolutionary crises in Germany 1919 to 1921, China 1927, and Spain mid-1930s. Its central theme is that with the consolidation of Stalinism, the Soviets placed a greater priority on their own national security than on promoting anti-capitalist movements abroad. The book consequently proposes a variety of ways in which the revolutionary impetus could be restored inside the Soviet Union. It emphasizes above all the need to provide for working class control over the state apparatus through the formation of democratic workers' councils. By revitalizing the institutions of class power, the Soviets would be far more likely to conduct a genuinely revolutionary foreign policy. The book argues that the communists should open their ranks to the expelled Trotskyists and otherwise overhaul their internal structures. In the absence of such sweeping reforms, the Soviet Union would stray further from the socialist path and would begin to function as an essentially counter-revolutionary force in world affairs. The book was arguably the most, quote, orthodox, end quote, text that James ever produced. As James acknowledged in the introduction, the principles advanced in the text were firmly based on the, quote, fundamental ideas of Marxism, end quote, specifically its Trotskyist variant. Quote, how much the book owes to the writings of Trotsky, the text can only partially show, end quote, James wrote. Footnote. C.L.R. James, World Revolution, The Rise and Fall of the Communist International, originally published in 1937, republished in 1993 with Humanities Press. End footnote. The truth of this statement is confirmed throughout the text, as when the author defends Trotsky's characterization of the Soviet Union as a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote. In later writings, as we shall find, James would take strong exception to this thesis. The book's Trotskyist lineage is also corroborated by its stress on the importance of building a new revolutionary international to defend the gains of October and forge new revolutions in the advanced countries. The last chapter, titled A Fourth International is the Only Hope, views such an international as the, quote, only hope not only for revolutionaries, but for the future of the quasi-socialist Soviet Union. Quote, the USSR, James flatly predicted, quote, cannot survive without a revolutionary international, end quote. James, World Revolution. As James wrote a few pages on, quote, if the Third International loses its last stronghold in France and fascism conquers in that country, then unless the workers of the world can create another international organization, the worker state of Soviet Russia is doomed, end quote. James, World Revolution. Following Trotsky, James argued that the coming period would produce a cataclysm on the scale of what was known as the Great War, and that this war would both test Stalinism's viability and create new avenues for revolutionary action. Something of the flavor of James' cataclysmic but ultimately hopeful assessment of the overall political situation was expressed in the first chapter, titled Marxism. Quote, we may well see, especially after the universal ruin and destruction of the coming war, a revolutionary movement which, beginning in one of the great European cities, in the course of a few short months, will sweep the imperialist bourgeoisie out of power not only in every country in Europe, but in India, China, Egypt, and South Africa. With an organized international revolutionary socialism could face the future without dismay. The task of rebuilding such an international has been begun. It is a race with time. End quote. James, World Revolution. In his autobiography, Frederick Warburg Riley observed that the Trotskyists, quote, loved the USSR as a child loved their mother, but they knew that the wicked father, Stalin, had debauched her and produced a miscarriage, end quote. Footnote. See Frederick Warburg, An Occupation for Gentlemen. The title comes from an exchange Warburg had at a cocktail party in London, where a rather patrician fellow told him that publishing sounded very enjoyable, but was it an occupation for gentlemen? I'm going to do some searches right now. Who is Frederick Warburg? Wikipedia says Frederick Warburg lived from 1898 to 1981. Frederick Warburg was a British publisher who in 1935 founded the company Zecker and Warburg. Frederick Warburg is best known for his association with the author George Orwell during a career spanning a large part of the 20th century and ending in 1971. Frederick Warburg published Orwell's major books, Animal Farm, 1945, and 1984, 1949, as well as works by other leading figures such as Thomas Mann and Franz Kafka. Other notable publications include The Third Eye by Lobsang Rampa, Pierre Boulle's The Bridge Over the River Kwai, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, and William Shearer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Warburg is an important figure in the history and study of Cold War propaganda due to his work with Orwell's widow, Sonia Orwell, in collaboration with the Information Research Department, a secret propaganda wing of the British Foreign Office, which helped to increase the fame of Animal Farm in 1984. With Warburg's support, the IRD was able to translate Animal Farm into more than 16 different languages, and for British embassies to disseminate the book in more than 14 countries for propaganda purposes. Warburg was also involved in the sale of the film rights to Animal Farm to the American Central Intelligence Agency. This deal resulted in the creation of the 1954 propaganda film, Animal Farm, which became the first feature-length animated film to be made in Britain. Back to the text and footnote. Warburg's Oedipal analysis was tempered by the recognition that the author of World Revolution and his intransigent comrades had a valid argument to make about Stalinism. Quote, the Trotskyists pointed out, with maddening persistence, that the Russian worker was poor, bullied by bureaucrats, the subject of an awesome tyranny, spied upon by a secret police. The state in Russia, they claimed, far from withering away as Marx expected, had become more omnipresent than ever. End quote. Footnote. Never mind. No footnote, just Warburg. Citation. Warburg, the book's publisher, went on to term World Revolution, quote, the Bible of Trotskyism, end quote. While this may have been a slight overstatement, the work did cover a great deal of material that was of vital interest to the movement. Trotskyists promoted the book in their press in North America, Europe, and elsewhere, and used it to familiarize recruits with their indictment of international Stalinism. Apart from Trotsky's own writings, many of which were as yet untranslated and otherwise inaccessible, World Revolution was the only critique available of the Communist International from a leftist, non-communist party perspective. Because of the controversial nature of the subject matter and the diverse range of cases under consideration, there were not even academic studies that covered the same ground from a less openly partisan perspective. Interested readers would have had to choose between James's revolutionary analysis and unreliable communist tracts. Despite its orthodox stance, Trotsky found fault with World Revolution, arguing that the book's account of the consolidation of Stalinism was, quote, formalistic, and that it situated Stalin's rise to power primarily in terms of exogenous factors, such as the failure of proletarian revolution to spread throughout Western Europe and the economic and military pressures placed on the Bolshevik government by liberal democratic regimes in the West, rather than recognizing the endogenous factors at work, such as Stalin's relationship to the bureaucracy and the political and physical exhaustion of the working class in the 1920s. Footnote. See Trotsky's article on the history of the left opposition. End footnote. Although Trotsky valued the book's contribution, Trotsky strongly believed that a proper understanding of the decline of the revolution and of the Communist International required a more probing look at political and socio-economic conditions inside the Soviet Union during the years of the revolution's, quote, degeneration. While both men agreed that the Russian experiment had been irreparably damaged by the lack of outside support, Trotsky was far more inclined than James to link the rise of Stalinism to the nation's underdeveloped or, quote, backward character. Even as he was helping to define the meaning of orthodox Trotskyism, James became engaged in a surprisingly suspect project, one that attested to his inherent open-mindedness. Through friends in Paris, James had come into contact with Boris Souvarine, a nonconformist intellectual who had served on the Central Committee of the French Communist Party before being expelled for, quote, Trotskyite deviations in the mid-1920s. For a short period after his expulsion, Souvarine had become active in the international left opposition before breaking with Trotsky in the early 1930s. For those interested, I have articles by and about Boris Souvarine on this channel. One is by Dan Labatz, which is about the relationship between Trotsky and Souvarine, which is very, very informative. Great essay. Souvarine's scathing biography, Stalin, A Critical Survey of Bolshevism, which I'm working on right now. I've only read the first chapter or so. Was published in France in 1935, and James translated the book from French to English. Footnote: Boris Souvarine, Stalin, A Critical Survey of Bolshevism. I'm not going to look that up because I've already started reading it, and I know what it is, so I'm assuming you do. Where am I? Souvarine's book documented for the first time the mediocrity of Stalin's career as a Bolshevik in the pre-1917 period and went into painful detail concerning Stalin's despotism in the period following Lenin's death. Instead of maintaining a broadly Leninist perspective as Trotsky did, Souvarine embraced a pluralistic, quote, democratic socialist, end quote, political viewpoint that emphasized the protection and defense of individual civil liberties under socialism. After the book received favorable reviews in a few liberal publications in Europe and North America, Trotsky coined the term Souvarinism as a term of abuse to describe democratic leftists who posited some form of continuity between Leninism and Stalinism. Stalin laid the blame for the degeneration of the Russian Revolution in two places: in the objective circumstances, particularly absence of successful socialist revolutions in Western Europe, and in Leninism's organizational premises. Souvarine did not believe that Lenin was insincere at his ultimate goals, but Souvarine did maintain that the Leninist concept of the, quote, vanguard party, end quote, with its hierarchical and secretive organizational principles, inevitably fostered a one-party state. In one passage, Souvarine argued that the tendency of the Bolsheviks to, quote, organize and to act as a disciplinary army capable of carrying out orders, end quote, was evident within months of the 1903 split with the Mensheviks. This quasi-military sense of discipline, Souvarine suggested, left the Bolsheviks, quote, always at the mercy of an error on the part of their leader and in danger of sinking into an intellectual passivity contrary to their theoretical mission as vanguard and model, end quote. Souvarine, Stalin, page 65. By the early 1920s, the Leninist Party had effectively provided Stalin the means to usurp power and dominate the new Soviet bureaucracy without having to cope with a democratic mass opposition. Thus, Souvarine could write of the, quote, miscarriage of Bolshevism, end quote, quote, democratic socialism, end quote. Souvarine mournfully concluded, quote, is almost everywhere allowing itself to be led, circumvented, and compromised by dictatorial communism. The death agony of socialist hope in the world thus opens up an immeasurable ideological crisis, end quote. Souvarine, Stalin, page 676. Despite signs that its preeminent black recruit was willing to entertain unorthodox opinions, James was one of two British delegates at the founding conference of the Fourth International, which was held in Paris in September 1938. Trotsky believed that the coming war would create a real opening for revolutionary socialists, and James worked hard to convince his followers that Trotskyism should be launched as a formal movement with its own international, the Fourth International. Many Trotskyists, such as the writer Isaac Deutscher, strongly opposed Trotsky's proposal, however, on the basis that it was premature and tactically unwise. The 1938 Transitional Program, which is on this channel, penned by Trotsky, who was unable to attend the conference, laid out the rationale for this move, and it served as the central document of the Paris Conference. The Transitional Program featured a list of, quote, transitional demands, end quote, which, while not explicitly socialist, were unattainable under capitalism in its current epoch. The demands included calls to, quote, open the books, end quote, that is, for employers to reveal the state of their finances to trade union representatives, and, quote, 30 for 40, end quote, a call for 30-hour work week for all workers at full pay. Through the application of transitional demands and the formation of unified Trotskyist parties, the Fourth International could take advantage of the coming crisis and rally the international working class around a genuinely socialist platform. The hallmark of Fourth International politics became its insistence that capitalism's periodic crises would undermine the communist movement and mobilize mass numbers of workers under the banner of Trotskyism. The conference's minutes record that James made 5 remarks to the gathering. The first 4 were more or less perfunctory in nature. The final comment, however, was quite suggestive. Quote, in view of the fact that ... the present Congress had dealt explicitly with the colonial question, end quote, he stated, quote, the Congress should officially instruct the English section, i.e. the Speaker, to work at a program on the colonial question and to suggest to the Executive Committee a definite plan for an international colonial bureau, which the EC would be empowered to establish, end quote. Footnote. See Will Reisner's edited volume, Documents of the Fourth International, published with Pathfinder Press, 1973. The description of this book says... the tumultuous decade of the 1930s saw the Great Depression, Hitler's rise to power, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Japan's invasion of China, the French Popular Front, the Spanish Civil War, the Moscow trials and Soviet purges, and the outbreak of World War II. These events transformed the fabric of political life on a global scale and tested the capacities of all political movements. In the face of these events, the Second Democratic International, I think it's supposed to say Social Democratic International, and the Third Communist International proved incapable of developing an adequate analysis and policy. That task fell to the International Trotskyist movement. The international left opposition under Trotsky's leadership began as a left faction of the Third International. In 1933, however, when the German Communist Party capitulated to Hitler without a struggle, the left opposition broke with the Third International and began to lay the framework for the organization of the Fourth International. Between 1933 and 1940, the left opposition and the left opposition's successors held 4 international conferences to assess Stalinism and other world political developments and to coordinate activity on an international scale. The analyses developed by these conferences were incorporated into the fundamental program and outlook of the Fourth International. This volume contains the documents adopted by these 4 international conferences, as well as selected additional documents issued between 1933 and 1935 and the minutes of the 1938 founding conference of the Fourth International. Many of them have never before been printed in English outside of the internal bulletin of the Fourth International and its sections. They are a basic source for tracing the development of the positions of Stalin's left-wing opponents, end quote. End footnote, back to the text. What would he have had such a bureau do? We can safely assume that its work would have had administrative and political dimensions, circulating and translating documents, promoting the formation of new Trotskyist groupings in colonial countries, prodding European Trotskyists to create alliances with expatriated anti-colonialists, and revising Trotskyist doctrine to more adequately encompass colonial issues. An agenda similar to this would be developed when James traveled to Mexico in 1939 to confer with Trotsky on the issue of black politics in the United States. What is conveyed here is James's forbearance regarding the Trotskyist sometimes less than impressive commitment to the anti-colonial cause. For the time being, despite whatever private reservations or concerns he may have had, James appeared on the surface at least to be a loyal Fourth Internationalist. As was true of his involvement in Pan-Africanism, James's rhetorical commitment to Trotskyism was matched by deeds. Ajit Roy, a law student at London School of Economics, later described what it was like collaborating with James in the Marxist group after their expulsion from the Independent Labour Party. Quote, James and I got together and we took a flat in Boundary Road, where James had another great devotee, a chap from the East End called Stanton. Our main task was to bring out the fight, I guess like the Trotskyist faction in the internet ILP like their manifesto, I guess, and to make open propaganda in street corner meetings. We built a portable platform, and the three of us, James, a tall West Indian, Stanton, a very Jewish-looking chap from the East End, and myself, an Indian, taking the portable platform to the shopping centers all over London, regarding ourselves as the vanguard of the British proletariat, ! Is all very amusing, but people did listen. Probably the very strangeness of it gave us an audience. But once James started speaking, he always got a crowd, end quote. Footnote, cited in Bornstein and Richardson, Against the Stream. The Marxist group eventually disintegrated after the expulsion, and its members finding their way into the Labor Party or other Trotskyist groupings. End footnote. According to Wikipedia, Ajit Roy lived from 1938 to 2011. Ajit Roy was a Bangladeshi singer, Sangeet singer. During the Liberation War of 1971, he sang inspiring songs called the Sangeet. Okay, this is not the same guy. Sorry, I thought this was the same guy. Error on my part. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything on this person. Sorry. It's really. Anyway, back to the text. Frederick Warburg offered further testimony to James's unflagging political commitment. Quote, night after night he would address meetings in London and the provinces denouncing the crimes of the bloodthirsty Stalin until he was hoarse and his wonderful voice a mere croaking in the throat. The communists who heckled him would have torn him limb from limb had it not been for the ubiquity of the police and their insensitivity to propaganda of whatever hue. If you told him of some new communist argument, he would listen with a smile of infinite tolerance on his dark face, wag the index finger of his right hand solemnly, and announce in an understanding tone, quote, we know them, end quote, as of a man who has plumbed human wickedness to its depth and forgiven it, since man even in his wickedness is pitiable, end quote. Ethel Mann. No shit. No. Who's that? End quote. Warburg, an occupation for gentlemen. Another engaging memoir of the times is Ethel Mannen's Comrade, O Comrade, a humorous, thinly fictionalized account of radical politics in the 1930s, subtitled Low Down on the Left. Wikipedia says Ethel Mannen lived from 1900 to 1984 and was a popular British novelist and travel writer, political activist, and socialist. Ethel Mannen was born in London. In the book, Ethel Mannen's Comrade, O Comrade. Yeah, I'm not seeing any descriptions of this book on Goodreads or Google Books, so moving on. In one chapter, Mary Thane, the author's stand-in, serves tea to James and two comrades as they discuss revolutionary politics. Quote, the eminent Trotskyist was an extremely handsome young Negro. He arrived with two white friends, end quote. She writes, quote, the Trotskyist arrived punctually at 4 and left punctually at 5, and in that hour Mary uttered exactly 12 words, end quote. These are, quote, hello, quote, this is Larry Lanahan from Ireland. Lanahan from Ireland. Sugar, more tea, cake, goodbye. The conversation is dominated by James's, quote, rich dark voice, end quote. that, quote, flowed like music, end quote. The content concerns the thesis that, quote, permanent revolution and international socialism must form the basis of all revolutionary strategy, end quote. Footnote: Ethel Mannin, Comrade of Comrade, or Low Down on the Left, published in 1949. A separate account of this odd social engagement, which appears in the autobiography of Ethel Mannin's husband, Reginald Reynolds, confirms the essential facts outlined in her novel. He writes, quote, Ethel had long hoped to meet C.L.R. James, whose intellect and good looks were praised by all except the Stalinists. She had invited him to tea one Sunday, and he arrived unexpectedly with two of his friends a week later, when the house was already full of guests. They arrived in the middle of a deep discussion which they had begun 2 hours earlier. In Hyde Park continued it with no apparent attention to anybody or anything else, and eventually walked down the garden path, still arguing, without, as Ethel said afterwards, any sign that they even knew where they'd been, end quote. Footnote: Reynolds says that one of James's two companions was Leary Constantine, quote, who was not very interested in politics at that time. It would, I suspect, have been more interesting to have detached Leary, bracket sick, and bracket Constantine, and talked to him, but whereas I could at least understand Trotskyist dialectics, I could imagine no suitable opening move for a man known only as a cricketer, end quote. Reginald Reynolds, My Life and Crimes. First off, Reginald Reynolds lived from 1905 to 1958 and was a British left-wing writer, poet, a Quaker, and anti-colonial activist who collaborated with M.K. Gandhi and Horace Alexander. A Quaker, Reginald Reynolds was a general secretary of the No More War movement from 1933 to 1937. Reginald Reynolds was perhaps best known as a critic of British imperialism in India and for his 1937 work, The White Shahibs in India. For many years, Reginald Reynolds was also New Statesman Weekly's satirical poet. Reginald Reynolds married the left-wing novelist Ethel Mannin in 1938. Reginald Reynolds was a conscientious objector during the Second World War when he worked in air raid precautions and in a mobile hospital unit. And his book, let's see if we can find anything for Reginald Reynolds, My Life and Crimes. Yeah, I don't think I'm seeing anything for this book. How am I doing? Is my recording? Okay, I'm still recording. Good. Where am I? Back to the text. End footnote. How much had James' character changed in this period? Not as much as one might suppose. Obviously, James had a far greater interest in politics than before, and James's newfound Marxism may have given him a somewhat more somber and determined outlook on life. There was nothing dilettantish about James's commitment to Trotskyism. At the same time, James retained his characteristic blend of inner confidence and public volubility. James continued to express himself in a lucid, crisp prose, and the Black Jacobins in particular reflects its author's steadfast love affair with the English language. In his dealings with comrades, political opponents, and strangers, James remained faithful to the public school code of his youth. Not least among the crimes of the communists in James's eyes was their lack of a sense of fair play. While some family members and childhood friends may not have understood or sympathized with his uncompromising radicalism, they would have surely recognized the romantic figure described by his publisher. Quote, if politics was religion and Marx his God, if literature was his passion and Shakespeare his prince among writers, cricket was his beloved activity. ... I can hear today the opening words of Twelfth Night, delivered beautifully from his full sensitive lips. Quote, if music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it, end quote. Excess, perhaps, was James's crime, an excess of words whose relevance to the contemporary tragedy, bracket, totalitarianism, end bracket, was less than he supposed, end quote. Footnote. Warburg, An Occupation of Gentlemen. Elsewhere in this book, Warburg said that, quote, James himself was one of the most delightful and easygoing personalities I have known, colorful in more sense than one, a dark-skinned West Indian Negro from Trinidad. He stood 6'3" in his socks and was noticeably good-looking. His memory was extraordinary. He could quote not only passages from the Marxist classics, but long extracts from Shakespeare in a soft, lilting English, which was a delight to hear, end quote. And Warburg. End footnote.
I'll probably bring some just in case. Is it all gone?
Yet this almost lurid portrait of a passionate devotee of poetry and language may be somewhat overstated. A nice corrective image is provided in his notes for his unfinished autobiography, where James describes a, quote, pub crawl, end quote, with Eric Williams in London in the mid